Hey folks, welcome to day 2 of virtual education in medieval literature with a focus on Dante's Inferno. Today we're talking about Cantos 4 and 5. Seems like the assignments were clear. Everyone seems to have gotten through them pretty well. Please let me know if they feel like they're taking a lot longer than maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. I do want to know, I'm sort of shooting blind here and hoping that you're learning but not feeling overburdened. In fact, I hope you're feeling restful, but of course, that might not be the case. For some of you, staying home like this is going to be pretty hard. Yeah, so, just like the beginning of class here, it might be helpful for you to take a few minutes right now, beginning this lecture, probably busily pounding through all the assignments your teachers are giving you. But let's take a moment and just really rest together, like we usually do. I know some of you appreciate this, and so hopefully now it's a good time for you to be quiet before the Lord. Our first minute will just be silence, except for this music. And then after that, I'll put a portion of scripture up from Colossians for us to meditate on for a minute. So I'll just leave you to it. Enjoy the silence. Be still and know that He is God. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience. Okay, so onward we go. First, a little bit of review. 3 main points to take away from yesterday. First of all, the idea that Beatrice, as a figure of beauty, is more than just a romantic interest for Dante. She is, in fact, a pathway to God. And I give you here another small slice of the quote I gave you yesterday from Robert Farrar Capon, who wrote the book Bed and Board. Beatrice is precisely a priestly figure. She is not my destiny, but the agent, the delightful sacrament of it. If I treat her as an end, delight is about all I can bargain for, and not even that for long. If I take her as a sacrament, I receive, along with the delight, the joy that lies behind her. It's a beautiful thought, and it's worth applying to just about anything you love. I've heard from your notes that some of you see a Beatrice kind of figure in your music. Some of you see it in an athletics event or a practice that you have. And I'm sure others of you actually see it in a person, which would be, hard to say openly, probably not best said in a lot of contexts. But in all these things, remember, these are just rays of sunlight leading us on to the source of light and heat itself, which is our God. And then dealing with the problem of hell, we remembered that Boethius taught us that God is, for him, all his attributes are like wetness to water. They are essential, intrinsic, and inseparable. And so this justice and the love, they go together in him. And it's still hard to wrap our heads around until we remember that love must be free. Remember that quote. It's coming up in our final novel called Fantasties this year. Love must be free. It implies freedom. It implies a choice. It implies that the one who loves can see, perceive, and behold the value and the worth of the thing that is loved. It also implies that the one who loves could not love. The one who loves could direct their attention, their will, their mind even, and their emotions away from the most beloved of all things, the most lovable of all things, and towards something else. So really what we see is that the moment a single free creature is created, capable of loving God, and that is the angels, that we have at that moment the creation of hell. Not necessarily as a physical place, of course, because angels don't have physical location, but as an idea or an experience of turning away from one's own happiness toward one's own misery, purposefully choosing the self and the choice of self over God. And so we realize that hell is simply the opposite of the love of God. It is the opposite of our happiness. It is the opposite of being participants in his divine nature. Now, we don't know all that that entails. We just know that Scripture says it is real. It is awful and terrible, the last place we would want to go. And in some strange and bizarre way, it is the first choice of every human being until their hearts are broken and melted and made new by the powerful grace of God. So just keeping those things in mind, I challenge you with doctrines of hell and doctrines of heaven to be free to think and imagine, but to keep your imagination and your thinking in the confines of what Scripture allows. So, and not to go any further with your dogmatism, right? We got what Scripture says. We can take it for what it says. Beyond that, there's a lot we don't know about heaven and about hell. Okay? All right, let's begin with the right now. This is our subject today is going to be pity and scorn with regard to those who receive eternal damnation. So here's a 90-second right now. Let me start you with this. What is the proper reaction to the just punishment of a truly guilty criminal? Okay, imagine somebody like currently in the news. We've got a guy named Harvey Weinstein who was abusive towards many women, committed rape in at least one case that I know of. And seems to have genuinely used his power for corrupt means. So think about him. He's now been sentenced to 23 years in prison. Or think of something more serious, like a serial killer being sentenced to death. Should we rejoice that justice has been served? Or should we pity the criminal? If we rejoice, are we arrogantly assuming that we're better than this person? If we pity them, are we questioning the judgment of our legal system? What's the right reaction to serious punishment of those who committed serious crimes? Take 90 seconds and give us an answer. Okay, hopefully you've been batting that around your head and thinking through your reaction to that. And it should be, for me, it's tough to say exactly how to feel. There's a sense in which I feel a kind of righteous indignation at particularly heinous crimes. And then there's, of course, a sense in which I realize there, but for the grace of God go I. Now, I'm going to give you something a little bit more challenging. We'll take it up another notch here. This is Jonathan Edwards in a sermon. And he says that the sight of hell's torments will exalt the happiness of the saints forever. Now, he's telling us that we're actually going to see it. If we make it to the other side, into the new heavens and new earth, we're actually going to be consciously aware of, maybe even visually aware of, the suffering of those who did not make it, and that will increase our happiness. It will not only make them more sensible, he says, of the greatness and freeness of the grace of God and their happiness. It will really make their happiness the greater, as it will make them more sensible of their own happiness. Now, what do you think of that? Do you agree or disagree? I'll give you another 30 seconds. I want you to respond to this one. Add it on to the previous right now and tell me what you think. Okay, now we're not going to hit this too hard today because actually this is going to be a major topic later in the Inferno. Around the time we get to the soothsayers and the simoniacs, we're going to hit this full force and try to get our heads around the proper response to the justice of God. But hopefully you're getting it kind of warmed up in your head. Here's some evidence for you to think about from recent readings. First of all, we've seen Virgil have pity already. Right before he was about to enter into limbo, Dante looks over at him and thinks, well, gosh, if you're this afraid, how am I supposed to go? He expects Virgil to be brave and kind of lead the way. And Virgil turns back and says, oh, I'm not afraid. It's pity. And this is the quote we have here. The anguish of the souls who dwell down here has painted in my face the pity you've taken to be fear. So Virgil himself feels a certain compassion and pity for the people that are suffering, perhaps especially for the people in limbo, but you'll see that he experiences this in other circles as well. Dante, when he beholds some of the great pagan intellectuals and heroes that he has spent his life studying, he too feels sorrow or pity for them. So he says, when I heard this, great sorrow seized my heart, for I saw men of great distinction there hovering in limbo at the edge of hell. Now, that's an experience of pity. You'll see the opposite. You'll see them also experience scorn different times. Keep your eyes peeled. In fact, you're even going to see a rebuke similar to what we see here in the Vision of St. Paul. Now, this is an apocryphal New Testament book, probably written in the 3rd century. I think it was pretty much condemned by the church, but it's still an interesting piece. It's listed in the appendix of your Inferno if you want to read a little bit more about it. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that he took a kind of mystical journey into the third heaven. And anyway, this is supposed to be the account of the parallel journey into the depths of hell. And, we don't trust it. It's not considered to be Paul's own hand or any kind of accurate description. However, as an imaginative experiment, it's a lot like Dante's Inferno, frankly. And Paul there, this character Paul will say, when he sees the suffering of the people in hell, he too feels pity. And the angel who's leading him along rebukes him and says, what are you doing? Are you more merciful than God? Thinking that Paul's pity and his compassion implies that maybe God made a mistake or something. So again, this is a real troubling kind of question, because if God punishes the damned for their rebellion and for their refusal to love him, the most lovable of all things, isn't that good and perfect in his right? Should we celebrate it? On the other hand, we realize it could have been us. It was just his supervening grace that got in the mix with us and changed our hearts and saved us. So shouldn't we also feel compassion for them or pity? I don't know. So you think it over, keep your eyes open, watch for pity, watch for scorn, and we'll just say for now there is more to come. Now, the next topic for us has to do with this strange moment when Dante and Virgil are speaking, and Dante asks, has anyone ever left here by his own or another's merits. We'll get to that conversation in a minute. But before I do, I want to introduce you to a term called harrow. This is a Winslow Homer piece here. It's the picture of an old farmer harrowing his field. It means to break up and prepare for sowing seed. It can also mean sort of to separate, and to divide, something like that. It's what you do to the soil to get it ready for planting. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, here we are. Dante is asking Virgil, just all his new questions, first trip to hell, this guy's got a lot of questions and he's curious. So he says, has anyone ever left here by his own or by another's merits to be blessed? Virgil says, well, as a matter of fact, yeah. Okay, he says, in fact, just after I'd entered in this state, when I saw one coming of power and might, crowned with the glorious sign of victory. And from us, he goes on to say, this guy took Adam and all the patriarchs. So that means that he's talking about Jesus Christ. Now, if you think about it, when Jesus was a baby, Virgil was probably getting on in years. You remember that Caesar Augustus is the one who took the census when Jesus was just a child. So that means that Virgil was probably alive and writing, and he dies, and some 30 years later, Jesus meets his own untimely death on the cross. And Virgil's saying that he came down to where Virgil was and rescued a bunch of the patriarchs. So what's going on here? Well, let's take a look at a famous creed that many of you have said before called the Apostles' Creed. In there, it says he descended into hell. Now, this is a very controversial rendering of it, but it's pretty common. The reason it's controversial is because some scholars and some theologians will argue that hell doesn't really exist until the end times, or hell is not really, there's not really a hell when Jesus first goes to the cross. They say that the word here is more like what the Greeks would call Hades and what the Hebrews would have called Sheol. Now, this is a generic term for the abode of the spirits of the dead. It was common in the ancient world. Just about every culture had some sense that all departed souls ended up in the same place. Now, the Egyptians were a little strange in this regard because, they thought perhaps if you weren't righteous enough, you didn't make it through. If you weren't wealthy enough, you didn't have a mummy, you couldn't even make it into this afterlife, the duat. But Greeks had this view. It seems, I hope you saw from your reading, that the psalmist too seems to think that going to the land of the dead is just no good at all. He in fact says, "Can I praise you from the dead?" Meaning that what good would it be for me to be there? It certainly doesn't imagine death as an entry into the presence of God. The psalmist doesn't. He mostly thinks of it as something to avoid. Now, there is also in the ancient world, both in somewhat in Hebrew, definitely, but in Greek and other cultures as well, there's a concept of being a place of punishment, but it's still all in the same spot. So you'll remember from reading the Aeneid probably that, Aeneas is walking around the underworld with his dad, showing him around, and he sees the people that are getting punished, and he just takes a few steps more and he's at the Elysian fields. So it's all the same realm for the ancient mind, though there is a kind of place for those who have done super rotten stuff to be punished. So you've got, you do have a kind of Tartarus in the Greek mind. You got Gehenna in the Hebrew mind. So what exactly is this idea that Virgil's talking about? Well, it's what's called in the medieval world the harrowing of hell. This is a pretty awesome mural of it right here. You can see Jesus. He's down in the realm of the dead here, grabbing his faithful people by their hand and taking them home to be, with the Father as spirits, waiting the time of the resurrection. This doctrine is still held by the Catholic and Orthodox churches, and it is believed that Jesus Christ is the only way of salvation. So prior to his sacrifice on the cross, even the patriarchs didn't have access to the presence of the Father because their sins had not yet been atoned for by the ultimate sacrifice of Christ. So they were essentially kind of in a holding pattern in the land of, we'd say, Hades or Sheol, just awaiting Christ's coming down to harrow them out of this underworld. And so many, many depictions like this can be found in medieval iconography. And like I said, it is a continuing belief in many congregations. Scripturally, well, there's actually some evidence for this. In Ephesians 4, when Paul's talking about the gifts, the different gifts that people in the church are going to have, he says the grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean? But that he also descended into the lower regions, the earth. He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. Now, this is one of the primary scriptures backing the doctrine of the harrowing of hell. The quote there in the middle that Paul uses is actually from Psalm 68, which is primarily a remembrance of the Exodus. Now, it makes sense that Paul would conceive of the cross and the Exodus together, because that's how New Testament writers thought of Jesus' death and resurrection. It was like a new Moses bringing God's people out of the promised land. In fact, when Jesus is transfigured, up on the mount, his disciples saw two men appear next to him, and they recognized the two men as Moses and Elijah. And the Moses and Elijah were actually talking to him, it says, of his departure. That's the ESV. The translation there is of the Greek term exodus. So in other words, Moses was like, hey, you're about to, this is, I did it once, but you're going to do it for real. This is it. You're about to pull off the biggest exodus in the history of time. And so, you can pay your money, take your choice on this one. It's certainly not one of those doctrines that we are going to call essential. It's not one of the ones we'll have dogma on, but there's a certain logic to this that I think is really attractive, and the scripture seems to suggest it, especially if we look back at this Ephesians 4 version. Certainly seems that Paul conceives of Christ literally descending to the lower regions of the earth. So he, like Dante, like everyone in the world, would have thought that the spirits of the dead actually go downward into the earth. And who knows, maybe they're right. But again, just an interesting concept. But it explains what Virgil's talking about. So basically Virgil's saying like, hey, Hades and hell were the same spot, until Jesus showed up. And then he took all of God's people out of here and just left us sinners. And so that's when it became kind of purely a place for the damned. Does that make sense? Hopefully so. Let's do some review. All right, now I'm going to give you a couple questions. I want you to make a guess at the question best you can, and then I'll give you the answer. So in your notes, I want you to write your first guess, and then if you need to make some notes, I'll give you the correct answer. Okay? I've got a little musical background. We'll take a few minutes to do this. Ready? Here goes. First thing, how does Jonathan Edwards answer the question, should the damned in hell be pitied? Go ahead and write your first answer. He says, the happiness of the blessed saints will increase by seeing the torments of the damned. Okay, good. Odd. Probably odd to some of you. All right, next question. How did Dante and Virgil respond to those they see in hell? Is it pity or scorn? Let's focus especially on limbo, that first place they went. How do they respond to those they saw in limbo? You said pity. You're right. First have pity. But just for now, keep your eyes open. You're going to see some scorn later on. Which words refer to the general dwelling of all departed souls, and which to the place of punishment? We got three options here: Hades, Gehenna, and Sheol. Right, if you said Hades and Sheol are the general dwelling, you're correct. Gehenna is the only one there for punishment. Probably I could have added Tartarus in there if I wanted. Last question. What is the harrowing of hell? What's the best biblical support for it? Christ descended to Hades to rescue the faithful and bring them forward. It's Ephesians 4 where we saw Paul talking about the descent and ascent of Christ. Okay, good. Let's move on now. We're going to look now at Canto 5 5, and from Canto 5 to Canto 4, we're actually moving from the first to the second circles. This movement is going to slow down over time because the circles are going to have increasing numbers of sinners kind of packed into them, ironically, as it gets tighter and tighter. Now, that first one was just like the unbaptized, the virtuous pagans, we call it limbo. The second one is for the lustful. Now, right away, you can guess your teacher is going to say, what do you mean by that? Lust, because we've taken a lot of pain early in this year to distinguish between lust and eros. Now, lust we defined as a craving for a kind of physical pleasure. The means through which the pleasure is attained doesn't really matter much when it's just purely lust. Eros, on the other hand, was a consuming love for the whole person. Now, common speech, even in the Middle Ages, described lust and lechery as any unlawful sexual desire. But C.S. Lewis tells us it's not so simple as that. In our modern age, where we have unfortunately a much stronger and clearer idea of what lust actually means, we can see how it's really distinct. It's really not the same thing. The desire, the sin of pornography, is in many ways different than the sin of adultery. There's something going on in the adultery, a love, a kind of possession with the beauty and the goodness of something, but that something being still forbidden. I do want to remind you, though, that eros is not a kind of platonic love, in the sense that it has no physical element to it. Lewis would have called Venus the sexual element in what he called eros, so Venus being the mother of eros. For Lewis, she represents the sexual element that's always a part of it, even when it's unfulfilled. So you got to keep that in mind, that the eros still has as its goal a kind of union of two people in a physical and spiritual means. Which brings us, of course, to these unfortunate people, Francesca and Paolo. Now, that book, of course, that they're reading there is the one that you and I and all your friends read earlier this year. Only these youngsters were able to understand it pretty well first time through. So they were reading in their own language, probably had the NIV version, unlike us. And man, they got into it fast. And I want you to keep a few facts in mind about these two. First of all is that Paolo is Francesca's brother-in-law. That means that when this dude cheats, he's cheating on his brother's wife. His brother is going to end up being not such a great character himself. He's going to murder them both, and they predict that he's actually going to be in hell a little lower than them because of murdering his own kin. It's called the region of Cani, after Cain, who killed Abel. But the question remains, was their sin lust, truly? Because that's what it gets called often. It's the circle of lust. Was it really lust as we would understand it, or is it more like eros, as we learned from Lewis? Read this excerpt, which Francesca gives to Dante as an explanation of what happened to her, and you decide for yourself. After reading this, I'll give you about 90 seconds to give yourself an answer here. Remember, the point of these write nows is to keep writing for the whole 90 seconds, to really keep your brain charged and active, creative and thinking, analyzing and interacting. She says to Dante, "Love that flames soonest in the gentle heart." Now, what she means there is the sensitive heart. Those hearts like Dante's that are smitten with poetry, beauty, art, the natural world, etc. In those hearts, love tends to flame up quickest, right? They're less practical, more sensitive. Love that flames soonest in the gentle heart seized him for that sweet body which was snatched from me. Now, the syntax there is hard to follow. What she means is that love seized Paolo, that is, the gentle heart here, for that sweet body. In other words, his love for me, my body, my physical person, which she says has been snatched from me, right? So she's just a spirit now. She's a wraith or whatever. So back to this. I'm going to read this now without stopping because I think the rest of it's a little clearer. Love that flames soonest in the gentle heart seized him for that sweet body, which was snatched from me, and how it happened hurts me still. Love that allows no loved one not to love seized me with such a strong delight in him that, as you see, it will not leave me yet. Love led us to one death. The realm of Cain waits for the man who quenched us of our lives. Again, let's take 60 seconds this time, just 60 seconds, and tell me whether you think it's lust or eros and why. Ready? Go. Okay, we're almost done, so don't worry. I'll go ahead and tell you what I thought on this one. I do think it's Eros still, even though the attraction was pretty strongly for her body. She says her "quote unquote" sweet body. I still think it's. I think it's Eros, and the clues to me are, if Paolo again were a womanizer and had, you know, all these women at his disposal. He could have chosen anyone, but he didn't. He fell for this girl. He fell for the forbidden love. And two, the fact that when they fell, they were reading, as we said earlier, the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere. To me, that just speaks to, striking up in these two lovers this, the god of love. And it became, listen to what she says, love allows no loved one not to love. She's talking about the tyranny of Eros. Eros became for them a god, and it struck fast and it struck hard. Who knows exactly what conditions led to it, but it sure seems to me like a case of idolatry of love rather than what we might call pure lust. All right, before we go, just want to introduce you to one last concept. It's called Contrapasso. Let's all say that together. Contrapasso. Anyways, great Italian word. You'll use it in exactly one occasion, which is Dante's Inferno. It's a pretty common term, though, used for analyzing his punishments, because you'll notice already that many of his punishments have a kind of irony to them. They are either the opposite of what was sought in the sinner's life, or they are ironic resemblances of what was sought in the sinner's life. Now, with Francesca and Paolo, we have the latter. What they experience in hell is actually, being whisked around by these winds of passion. So they're being blown around, it says, like birds, the text said, who can't resist the wind, and they are bashed and battered by this wind. Now, this punishment reflects their choice because they allowed passion, which is itself like a powerful wind, to override reason, which would be the firm foundation. And see, this is Dante working with a classic understanding of the tripartite human soul. You've got reason, which ought to be the ruler, and it ought to have as its subjects the emotions or the passions. Those are really kind of two sides of the same coin, represented there by the heart, and the will, to act, represented there by the hand. So reason, in the properly ordered soul, reason ought to rule, while passion and will are essentially servants carrying out the dictates of reason. But with the case of Paolo and Francesca, this has all been switched around, and we have a usurpation of the proper role of reason, and now the passion is allowed to rule. So you get what you pay for, Dante says. If what you want is to be ruled by this whimsical and unpredictable force of emotion or passion, then in the afterlife, that's exactly what they get. They are together, but there is no rest for them. They are in constant torment as the wind blows them around and smashes them up against the sides of Inferno and whisks them over the edge and terrifies them constantly. All right, well, that's it for today. You've got another little bit of reading tonight, and I'm hoping that I can pull off a discussion with you guys. I think it's on Thursday. We'll see how that works. It's just a little experiment on my part, so feel no obligation to make it. I'd love to see a few of you to see how it works. I'll be communicating with you about what kind of information you might need to join me on that. But anyways, hope you have a great day. It's been a pleasure talking about this stuff with you. Hope you're enjoying Dante's Inferno. And anyways, I miss you guys. And get some rest. Stay healthy. Bye now.